Cast your mind back 20 years to the crazy days of LAN parties and Quake and Unreal death matches, arena shooters that required razor-sharp reflexes and honed skills to survive. In the midst of all these caffeine-fueled excessive jibfests, there was a games industry professional named Steven Spielberg, who also made some movies on the side apparently. He thought it would be a nice idea to make a video game based on the premise of his recent movie Saving Private Ryan. The first two games from his new Medal of Honor series were console exclusives, developed by DreamWorks and Rebellion. They both sold well and proved that there was a market for a more cinematic and historical take on the shooter genre. The director decided he wanted to make a third game, and got in touch with id Software, who were too busy to develop a military shooter set in World War II because they were developing a military shooter set in World War II. Return to Castle Wolfenstein was released by id late in 2001 and sold well because it was a first-person shooter by id. Check it out. Meanwhile, Spielberg's people got in touch with 2015 Games, who were recommended to him by id as a replacement for DreamWorks due to their previous work on Sin. Tom Kuderka hired a crack squad of additional developers to create this huge cinematic title, and lots of those people would go on to create Call of Duty. But before all that went down, they gave us Allied Assault. Private Lawnie McLawnface is standing in a field. He has no weapons training, and must slowly pick up how to shoot things in the id Tech 3 engine. He learns important skills like looking at buildings, walking and climbing, and blowing up tanks with explosives, and throwing grenades, and Colonel Hargrove runs through a briefing and gives him a typed up letter explaining what it is he'll be doing, and so Lawnie's mission begins on the bed of a truck. The Nazis don't buy the papers, so naturally it's time to shoot them all. But these are no ordinary Nazis. No, these are Quake III Nazis. They're dangerous foes with pinpoint accuracy, and most don't go down with a single shot unless you're really accurate. It's no cakewalk compared to modern shooters. There's no chest-high walls, regenerating health, or remotely fair tactics from the opposition. Every soldier he was to encounter had the potential to kill him, and would get both increasingly devious and dangerous in his tour of duty as it progressed. They're ambushed in a small town, and Lawnie panics and heads for the stairs, where he gets his first taste of turret, only to discover that everyone else in his squad is dead. Still shaking after surviving the Nazi ambush, he finds himself alone in a foreign land, with just his M1 rifle for company. He wasn't looking for a fight, but judging from all the Nazis getting into the truck, he was in for one. Lawnie himself was about as stealthy as the departing truck, so he couldn't stay out here in the open. Looking up at a jail cell, he noticed a man who didn't look like a Nazi. He walked into the building, straight into a group of people who definitely were Nazis. His scattershot fire somehow took the men out, without alerting the entire area, and with his new friend seeming to know where to go and what to do, Lawnie followed him like a lost lamb, occasionally offering support in the form of wayward gunshots. Apparently his ally was some sort of spy. Was this who they were supposed to rescue? Instead of trying to escape, they went after confiscated documents, and Lawnie had no choice but to follow, then pick up explosives, which he was fine to handle after the extensive 60 seconds of training. After destroying some flat guns, Lawnie and his new friend parted ways, and he was alone once again. His ally told him to sneak in and find things to plant explosives on, and as previously established, stealth was something that happened to other people. So there was an inevitable shooting spree. Creeping from shed to shed, the private spotted some tanks that looked quite combustible, but realized he would need to set all 3 charges before initiating the chain explosion to confuse the Nazis. Avoiding the searchlights, Lawnie went looking for more tanks. Like bloodhounds with a fresh scent, his German foes knew exactly where to look no matter where he hid, so he took shelter near some explosive barrels. Turns out that Nazis are allergic to benzene, whatever that is. Private Lawnie was not a chemist, but his ordnance seemed to ignite the barrels in a most satisfactory fashion. He also made another useful discovery. Spotlights and their operators could be shot at, which eliminated a large chunk of the creeping around. After his explosive exploits, he met up with his secret agent pal for a turret section. If it's one thing that the private was good at, it was spray and pray with a belt-fed machine gun. Despite causing chaos, Lawnie let a plane from the airfield take flight, and because he missed the destruction of one target, it took a little longer to complete than expected. Due to that performance, the secret agent decided he'd be better off without Lawnie's company, and who could blame him? So he was dumped off in a bunker to fend for himself. He took out his frustrations on the Nazis and their radio equipment, and despite his suspect aim, he began to notice that the Germans kept dying and he didn't. Emerging on a sea road, he made his way to a lighthouse to signal for help. Help arrived! In the form of a truck full of Nazis. Realizing his exposure, McLawnface worked his way down the spiral staircase and dispatched his foes, at which point a second truck conveniently showed up and did nothing. The agent had wanted to see if Lawnie could handle himself before giving him a lift, leaving 2 Nazi soldiers out front for him to dispatch, as he sat behind the wheel scratching himself. How courageous of him. Command didn't realise that he had only survived the previous missions through sheer luck, and sent him out to rendezvous with Major Grillo in a snowy base in Norway, only for the Major to immediately get himself killed. Seeing his death staring him in the face, Lawnie was offered a surprising reprieve. They gave him a sniper rifle. With an MP40 to deal with people up close and the sniper to do the opposite, the private proceeded deeper into the base. Something about documents and submarines. All he knew was that he had to keep killing Nazis, and somehow it would all work out in the end. He found his way out of the cold and into the depths of some strange facility. Entering the changing rooms, he discovered a uniform and some papers, and a wild idea entered his head. Sure, he didn't know a word of German, but if he just looked like he knew where he was going and shoved these documents in their faces, he could go where he pleased. By sheer luck, Lawnie managed to stumble his way through to the scientists and their prototype. Now he had to find a way to destroy this weapon without attracting attention. A devious ploy worthy of a super spy would need to be concocted, or he could just do that. Yes, there were no soldiers about, and the workers who had been drafted into building these subs weren't paid enough to care about loud gunshots and screaming scientists. Now it was time to get to the sub. The soldiers here were less inclined to believe that Lawnie was a mute German, and his papers weren't of high enough rank to help him slip by undetected. He would need another fiendish ploy of intricacy in order to... Unfortunately, this meant that the entire base was alerted to his presence. But something was changing within Private Lawnie. The coursing of the blood through his veins, the fact he was still alive despite every attempt from the Nazis to stop him. He could do this! He could take the entire base. Setting up camp at the far end of the dock, McLawnface sniped the initial opposition to his master plan of killing everyone in the area before spraying them with an MP40 at close quarters. Nearing the end of his reserves, Lawnie switched back to the sniper and took out the remaining Nazis in a certifiable bloodbath. Working his way into the building, he refreshed himself with some canteens. Whatever the Nazis kept in those, it certainly wasn't water. The healing properties were tremendous. Then he made his way into the ventilation system. The unfair and overwhelming number of Nazis had messed with the wrong guy, and Lawnie was sudden death from above as he rattled off his MP40 with no regard for stealth or German well-being. If they weren't going to play fair, neither was he. Officer after officer fell before his fury, and he kept pushing forward. Still they came for him, in even greater numbers now, and Lawnie kept pushing forward, mowing down dozens of soldiers, regardless of whether they got the drop on him or not. He was the last thing they would ever see, to the point that they started to hide from him. Word of the crazed Amerikaner on a warpath had reached the ears of the inhabitants, and they started lobbing grenades and sending higher-ranking officers after him. And still, Lawnie kept pushing forward, out into the snow that he would paint red with the crimson failure of the enemies he had laid waste before him, until he spotted a train. Allies had come to his rescue. Tired and in shock from his ebbing adrenaline, Private Lawnie crawled aboard. And this is where the tone of the game changes. Operation Overlord, Omaha Beach, Normandy, 1944. thousands of soldiers mowed down by machine guns as they stormed the beach, and a setting that is intentionally near impossible to complete without death. When you make it past the beach under constant fire, you must blast through barbed wire, then navigate your way under fire through a minefield into the German trenches. And no shooter up to that point had depicted such a harrowing experience. You will die, just like thousands of others did that day. Which is what made it so satisfying for Lawnie McLawnface when he made the German bunkers and started picking off the troops that had been doing the same to his allies, before finally turning the machine guns on the Germans, single-handedly forcing their retreat. Captain Ramsey from A Company met Lawnie in Normandy to penetrate enemy lines and disrupt defences. With his Browning automatic rifle in hand, he proceeded to clear the first house of Nazis, only for another group to discover them after the firefight. It was a close-fought contest in tight quarters, but he pulled through by the skin of his teeth. A mounted gun soon persuaded the Germans that opposing him was a bad idea. Who needs accuracy when you have near infinite ammo? Venturing further inland, Lawnie and his partner were stopped by cannons placed on the road. They had to find another way around. After meeting a company with a radio, they discovered that a series of German snipers were in the way. It was up to McLawnface to flank them, as taking them head-on was suicide. In the safety of the farmhouse, Lawnie leisurely went about exploding heads with his sniping, before setting off to retrieve the radio. Just like the last time the Germans arrived, just like the last time Lawnie mounted a belt-fed machine gun and laid waste to them. It was now up to his team to destroy the anti-aircraft guns, so he could radio in the airstrike on the cannon. Lawnie sniped the bunkers from afar until all was quiet. Too quiet. He crept forward under the branches of trees and placed explosives on the anti-aircraft gun before making his way over to the machine gun. He knew, and for a third time he let them taste a machine gun. But this time some stragglers were wise to his ploy and hid around a corner. The private took exception to this and filled them full of lead. He called in the airstrike and destroyed the cannon blocking their way. Lawnie and his company headed deeper into Nazi-occupied France, and had to resort to using an unwieldy Panzerschreck against vehicular opposition. The Nazis further inland were much more formidable than their earlier opposition, and a pitched battle commenced in the ruins of a small French village, with Lawnie and his men fighting valiantly for every inch that they crawled through these buildings. Then the Tiger tank appeared, and started blowing holes in the walls that the brave soldiers clustered behind. He peppered it with his Panzerschreck amid crumbling mortar and clouds of dust, and eventually knocked it down with a last-ditch flanking manoeuvre. Lawnie pressed on, massacring Nazis by the dozen, and navigated the ruins until he came to the church. A most fortifiable position, so he knew what would happen next. Taking cover behind the gravestones, Private Lawnie began sniping, agonizingly moving forward against seemingly insurmountable numbers. There was nothing of value in the bombed-out church, just the bodies of the fallen. So they set off again, straight into a series of bunkers guarding the guns he had been sent to destroy. It was an open field with little cover, and barbed wire strung about the place inhibiting movement. They had to clear the bunkers before moving on. Did I mention the minefield too? They had one of those. Under fire from the guns they had been sent to sabotage, Lawnie's crew fought their bloody way to victory, and the final end of the Normandy campaign. Alone with his M1 again, Lawnie set out to meet a member of the French resistance, and met a downed pilot on the way. With his new buddy in tow, they made it to a church that wasn't in ruins, but his previous experience with religious buildings stood him in good stead, and the German outposts and ambushes were met with furious retaliation. It also definitely didn't take him forever to discover that the church altar was the way to the secret French resistance base. His contact insisted that he go in quietly with a silenced pistol, and that it was a fool's errand to do otherwise. More sabotage was on the cards, but Private McLawnface had to do it his way, slaughtering the Nazi camp and sabotaging their Tiger tanks. A long railroad stretched out before him, but he had acquired a scoped Carabiner 98K. He messed with the track signals and progressed through the station, mowing down foes with his MP40 and sabotaging things the resistance couldn't reach. With their minimal aid, he bombed the station and rode off on the back of a truck. The truck set him off in the middle of a German base, which was less than ideal. Stealth was still the #1 priority, and for this task he was handed a riot shotgun. What? He had to sneak into the base, radio a false communique, uncover battle plans, steal a manifest, and find tank documentation. Then finally he had to part the Red Sea and enact world peace. A ridiculous task for a single individual. This was the turning point in the game, and one that a lot of older shooters utilised, where the difficulty would ramp up for the final few missions to an obscene degree, forcing you to wear out your F5 autosave button in the process. While some enemy movement and scripted scenarios were cheap, they were still playable. The previous mission had been a slog, but it was nothing compared to what was about to come. Sniper's Last Stand is an infamous level. You're tasked with infiltrating the ruins of a small town that has become a glorified sniper's nest. Each of these snipers have been hand-placed in the most awkward positions to find, often where visibility is poor, for you, not them. Even worse than this, they can unload 3 shots with lightning speed, meaning if you get caught in their sights, you're as good as dead. Lastly, the level designer chose to break the game logic in order to boost their accuracy levels to near 100%. What follows is a series of gotcha moments that attempt to emulate the sniper scene from Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. The atmosphere is great, the music is tense, the level design is good, the enemy placement and buffing is some of the worst and most frustrating I have seen in a game, or in this case, haven't seen. Visibility is hindered by bad weather, and you're completely taken out of the moment by having to constantly save every time you take a step. In addition to this woe, you have to uncover a hidden Panzerschreck in one of the buildings in order to proceed past a locked gate. This leads to an escort mission with painfully weak allies that are essential. Lose too many of them and the game automatically ends. After coming out of the end of this, you're in a heavily scripted tank scenario with a limited number of shots you can withstand. The destructible elements are fun here, but keeping your vehicle in one piece is not. Last but not least, you have to fight your way through hordes of Nazis to a high vantage point and prevent them from blowing up a bridge. This is doable despite the terrible reload speed of your sniper rifle, but only just. You're then tasked with spotting enemy tanks, and it's much easier. So of course the game has to throw you a curveball. You see, you're not just spotting, you also have to keep your head on a swivel and fight off the battalions of soldiers thundering up the stairs to gun you down. Nothing says fun in a military shooter more than time-sensitive multitasking. You reach a point in the game where you can handle anything it throws at you, and so the design shifts from creative to sadistic, with all semblance of realism sacrificed at the altar of malicious design intent. Allied Assault isn't the first to do this, but because it's set in an actual place, this makes it all the more egregious. A roided-up superhero that sweeps all before him in a symphony of carnage might handle such opposition. A single trooper in the 40s, even with Lady Luck smiling upon them, would have no chance to survive these trials. So while I applaud the game for trying something different that other players enjoy, it ultimately serves as a detriment to folks like me as they foray deeper into the campaign. With that clearly in mind, Private Lawnie ventures out into the final leg of his mission. The Siegfried Forest is a cold and inhospitable place covered in snow and darkness, with limited visibility and snipers everywhere. There are no landmarks to orient yourself by, and an excessive number of Nazis to punish you from straying from a very careful course, one that you must determine through trial and error. Just like in the sniper's nest of a village. Health is limited, the enemies are well trained and armed, and can spot you coming a mile off. The objective markers on your compass are close to useless, and it took me 40 minutes to traipse through this horrible nightmare. I eventually resorted to downloading a map, otherwise Private McLawnface would have laid down and died in the frost. The second forest map is easier, with a single fixed weapon atop a bunker to destroy, and then it's a simple case of traversing to a fortified base, complete with bunker and watchtower. At this point, Lawnie knew he was supposed to acquire some papers and bluff his way into stealing the schematics and working prototype of the new Nazi weapon. Unfortunately, his firefight had alerted the inhabitants of this underground base, so stealth was off the table. Or was it? After lumbering his way down the stairs, it turns out that the soldiers deeper into the complex had not heard of his exploits. Lawnie managed to present papers effectively for a grand total of 25 seconds. The German officer was not impressed that he had stolen a second set of papers in front of him, and despite running after him brandishing said papers, for some reason the officer just refused to believe him. So a frostbitten and scattershot private proceeded to massacre the closely confined soldiers in a panic. After discovering and mowing down some scientists, he knew he was on the right track, and found a super secret weapon, propped up against a wooden crate. After discovering the plans that detailed how this marvelous device of death worked, Private Lawnie blew up their supply of a weapon. Then, after going the right way, utilised his own weapon repeatedly on a swarm of soldiers, who all must have been deaf and on their lunch break while he had been gunning down their comrades. Fighting his way to the surface through bodies of Nazis, he emerged into the fire of a second watchtower. A third watchtower fell to his sniping, and still the Germans came after him, so he took the fight to them, ducking in and out of their own bunkers for cover. Ploughing his way through the snowy wastes, Private Lawnie finally reached civilization. An entire town to refresh and recover in, except that the inhabitants had been replaced with rather unwelcoming Nazis. And so for 20 minutes he got hopelessly lost in the winding maze that was the small French town, constantly hounded by opposition that seemed more interested in tripping alarms and winning by weight of numbers than a fair fight. Justifiably angry at this, Lawnie swept his way into the main compound that the Germans had erected just outside the town, and planted as many bombs as he could all over the premises. Legging it through the snow, his ears rang with the sound of alarms as impediments disgorged themselves from the buildings, trying to hold him down and cut off his escape. Unfortunately for them, Lawnie came across the prototype weapon, and it was the Sturmgewehr 44. They fell before his gunmanship like threshed wheat, their blood frozen in the chill of the French winter frost. There would be no stopping him as he hurtled out of a window and at last to freedom. A stained letter had Colonel Hargrove beseech him to continue his unbelievable onslaught, pointing Private Lawnie in the direction of a train station, and warning him that it was covered by machine gun towers. He murdered anyone he came into contact with on his way there. After nearly getting run over by a speeding train, he realised that following the tracks might well lead him to the station. This brilliant bit of deduction led to more Nazis, and a loading station so heavily filled with spotlights that there were more spotlight operators than train drivers. Lawnie ducked and weaved his way through the lights like Sugar Ray Robinson, but he was on the receiving end of an odd right hook from the machine gun fire. They knew he was here, but they seemed under strict orders to stay in their towers like hens on the roost. He tampered with their generators, but it made precious little difference. He would need to dance through the lights again. No matter how many operators he sniped, there was always one more to spot him, but the cold urged him on. Creeping through the darkness, he spotted an open door. Should he lob a grenade in there? Nah. Sturmgewehr! He messed with their radio transmissions and waited for reinforcements to arrive. It was finally time. It began in a cramped train carriage more suited to bags of grain than men. Lawnie huddled with his fellow soldiers in quiet anticipation, and then the snipers started picking them off one by one. With greatly diminished forces, the private was up against the most overwhelming odds he had ever faced, and he largely had to do it by himself. There were no more disguises or fortunately placed weapons this time. Health canteens were at a bare minimum, and the opposition were both well drilled and expecting him. Every corner of the winding fort was death, and all semblance of fairness or realism dispensed with, as he was expected to gun down hundreds of Nazis, improbably winning every individual duel with minimal health. Even the AI had been tweaked, and the pinpoint accuracy and reflexes of the computer became a chore to slog through rather than a challenge. The F5 key received a battering that it had never experienced, even during the sniper village, as you're repeatedly cut down by endless swarms of Nazis or hidden groups that spring upon you like a hunting cat in full flow. You plant explosives, winding ever deeper into the depths of this seemingly endless morass of samey corridors and ticking off a laundry list of duties to perform single-handedly. If you don't tear your monitor clear of your graphics card and chuck it down the nearest window in frustration, further toil awaits you in the form of vision impairment. That's right. Not happy with having the odds stacked against you, the game belabors you with a gas mask as you fend off your foes, to the sound of constant heavy breathing and sight consisting of 2 eye windows. Should you somehow set the last explosives despite a lack of peripheral vision, you need to exit the winding level within a set time, and then play a game of flee the instant death explosion as you're corralled like a dumb farm animal through predetermined sections of the level. The final insult to this absolute monstrosity of a mission is that the Nazis will stop fleeing for their lives and engage you in combat. So not only are you avoiding the explosions and the fire and navigating the cramped spaces within a certain time frame, you are also now avoiding gunfire and preventing squads of Nazi death troops from cutting you down. Even the game's developers are aware of this, leaving full health cartons at certain points in the level. Improbably surviving this, you make it to the exit of the level, only to be met by a group of Nazis in cover directly outside the exploding facility, hunkered down and ready to fill you with lead instead of escaping themselves. And if you, with almost no cover except the flames licking at your boots, get incredibly lucky and pick off each of these throws in the time permitted, you've still not won your freedom. There are 2 snipers posted outside in guard towers. If you tag one, the other will end you before you have chance to turn. It was at this point that I stopped and looked up how to complete this damn exercise in masochism. Turns out you have to flee to a specific corner of the map and then wait for a scripted explosion to occur, which will cause the train door to open and your allies to rescue you. Despite these complaints, Medal of Honor is a brilliant game. Well, 3/4 of it is. It's steeped in atmosphere, takes its cues from some of the best modern war movies ever, and really makes you feel like you're in the thick of it. By modern standards, the engine is old and quirky, but that adds to its charm as you really need to be made of stern stuff in order to overcome it. So the lack of cinematic moments, knee-high cover, regenerating health and celebrity guest appearances really set it apart from the series that would follow it. While it would be a disservice to call this Call of Duty Zero, in hindsight that's exactly what it is. The scripting would become tighter, the engine would become better, and the mapping and general flow of the games would mean less frustration for the player, and then it would become a dumbed-down mess that anybody could complete. But we'll not talk about that. Any fans of military war films who also aren't a stranger to id Tech Free would get a kick out of this game, and people of taste who enjoy the early Infinity Ward titles much more than the later ones should definitely check this out. But much like Private Lawnie, I'm completely exhausted from this experience, and will be signing off from active duty. Until next time.